Let's talk about the general Kimura system, which my students and myself employ so often in training and in open competition. The broad outlines that I want to convey to you. First, there are 7 varieties of Kimura which we use. Unquestionably, the most important, the one which we use the most, and which is most associated with the notion of Kimura amongst all of you, is the figure 4 Kimura. This is the Kimura which we all know and learn in our earliest days in Jiu-Jitsu. From there's a bunch of alternative methods which are made necessary by the fact that we run into strong resistance to the well-known and basic figure 4 Kimura. There is a figure 4 bicep Kimura where we switch our grip and shorten it up to a grip rather like a mata-leon, a stranglehold, and tighten our grip on the Kimura and change the basic braking dynamics of the move. We'll explain this as we get further into the video. There is also a cross Kimura where the legs are employed very, very effectively to greatly increase braking potential in situations where it's difficult to get your opponent's hand behind the back. There is Kimura Plata, a mix between the Kimura and an omoplata, where once again it's used in situations where it's tough to get the hands behind the back. This is often used by a famous competitor from Norway and often referred to as a Tarika Plata, named after him. In addition, there is the Trimura, which is a hybrid between triangle and Kimura. This is one of our absolute favorite ways of immobilizing an opponent's head and reducing the amount of resistance that he can bring against us as we work our way to Kimura. Often it's done from bottom position. It can be done from side control too. It'll be a different triangle, but same principle. We also occasionally employ one-handed Kimuras in specialized situations, and these two can be a very, very effective addition to the arsenal. Now, everything we've done so far, the figure 4 Kimura, the figure 4 bicep, the cross Kimura, the Kimura Plata, the Trimura, the one-handed Kimura, they all begin with the figure 4 Kimura. An exception to this is the 7th Kimura we will often use. This is the legs Kimura. Here, the legs are used from the beginning of the application of the move. There is no figure 4 Kimura here. We go straight in with the legs, and we often use this as an attack against turtle position, and this too has an important part in the system overall. So our first feature of the Kimura system is that there are 7 different Kimuras. Unquestionably, the basic and standard figure 4 is the king of them all. Most of the Kimura attacks we employ come off this, so it's important we have a strong understanding of this as the foundation of the Kimura system. So a multiplicity of different Kimuras, but one of them, of course, is king, the figure 4 Kimura. Once we understand that there are going to be different forms of Kimura, then it's time to start looking at the direction of the Kimura system. As we implied earlier, the foundation of the Kimura system will always be the standard figure 4 Kimura. The application of the standard figure 4 Kimura creates the central problem that motivates and gives direction to the system overall. This is the problem of getting your opponent's hand behind the back. Whether or not you can put your opponent's hand successfully behind his back or not will determine how you go to act using our Kimura system. On many occasions, you will be able to quickly get your opponent's hand behind the back. The moment you do this, we always urge our opponents to go directly towards submission holds. This can be done from both top position and bottom position. A key element in both situations, both top and bottom, is the establishment of what we call a power line. There are certain situations, certain positions that I can hold my body relative to my opponent's body, which greatly increase the amount of power that I can bring to bear into the Kimura which I'm using against my opponent. There is a distinct top position power line, usually employed from a side pin. There is also a very distinct bottom position power line, usually employed either from close guard or from some variation of a triangle. Usually we employ this in situations where we call what we call the Trimura, the half Kimura half triangle. Now, as much as we enjoy the idea of getting our opponent's hand quickly and efficiently behind the back, there will be many occasions where you cannot do so, and you will have to work with your opponent's hand in a strong defensive position in front of his stomach and hips and legs. In these situations, we go to our next alternative means of operating. The first is to employ our legs into the application of Kimura. Traditionally, Kimura is done with my two arms against my opponent's arms, but when his two arms are locked together defensively, we want as much as possible to avoid situations where it's just my two arms working against his two arms. A traditional criticism of Kimura is that it's a strong man's move, that ultimately it's just my two hands working against my opponent's two hands. That's something as much as possible we want to avoid. If we find ourselves in a situation where I cannot separate my opponent's hands and get his hand behind the back, then we must go into this idea of using our legs against our opponent's arms. One of the favorite ways of doing so involves the use of cross Kimura and Kimura plata, or Tarika plata as it's often known. In these situations, we use the strength of our legs to force our opponent's hands behind the back. Always remember, of course, that the legs are significantly stronger than our arms. So if I have a strong-armed opponent, I will use my legs to force the hand in behind the back and get back into submissions. Nonetheless, there's going to be times even the use of our legs cannot get the hand behind the back. And then, once again, we find ourselves having to work in against an opponent with a Kimura lock on, but with his hand in front of his stomach, hips, or thighs. In these situations, we often recommend a switch to another submission hold. So, for example, an armbar, Judogatami, or a triangle. Another great option is to switch completely to a different position. The two key skills or skill sets that we work with here and which play a big role in our Kimura system are the so-called T-Kimura position. We have a whole section on that which we'll go over, in which we can keep an opponent's hand in front of his chest and move around his body and go from different position and into a multitude of positions, submissions, etc., etc. Another one which we strongly favor is the head and arm Kimura, which is a great avenue towards our opponent's back. Between the T-Kimura and the head and arm Kimura, we have excellent positional alternatives whenever we can't get the hand behind the back and go for basic submission holds. The Kimura system has a group of core concepts which give it a very distinctive look and flavor. The first of these core concepts or principles is the multiplicity principle. The idea is that whenever we work with any given submission hold, we'd never want to limit ourselves to one variation of the submission hold. Typically, submission athletes do much better when they have a multiplicity of submissions. So, for example, the Kimura system, we've seen that we employ 7 different varieties of Kimura. There are others beyond that. We don't happen to use them. We believe that they're better covered by alternative methods of attack. But when you talk about Kimura, there's not just one Kimura move. There's, in our system, 7 and a bunch of others outside of that. When you have a multiplicity of locks, you can get around the many different contingencies and problems that you often find crop up when you're in live sparring situations. Often our opponents provide unexpected lines of resistance. If you have to hammer through every line of resistance with just a single tool, it's very difficult work indeed. But when you've got a multiplicity of tools, suddenly the job becomes a lot easier. It's very, very important you study a group of Kimuras rather than just any one Kimura variation. The second great principle that we work with is the front-back asymmetry. There is a fundamental fact about the human body that when the hands are in front of our body, they are typically very strong and very well coordinated. But once the hand gets put behind the back, it becomes dramatically weaker and less coordinated. This is just a fundamental fact about the human body. People will often tell you that Kimura is a strong man's move. You can make the strongest man very weak indeed by putting his hands behind his back. As much as possible, when we first lock a figure 4, our first goal is to quickly and efficiently get the hand behind the back and cut down the amount of resistance that our opponent can bring to bear against us. This takes advantage of this simple and easily observable asymmetry in the human body. A second asymmetry in the human body, which we also look to take advantage of as much as possible, is the arms versus legs asymmetry. In every human body, the legs are dramatically stronger than the arms. You may have an opponent whose arms are much stronger than your arms, but there are very, very few opponents indeed whose arms are stronger than your legs. So whenever you find you cannot get the hand quickly behind the back, take advantage of this asymmetry. Bring your legs into the Kimura game. Once you start using legs as a means of forcing your opponent's hand behind the back, you no longer get trapped in situations where it's just your arms against your opponent's arms. This is always something we're trying to avoid. Remember always that the age-old criticism of Kimura is that it's just my two hands versus his two hands. That's what we're trying to avoid in the Kimura system. In these situations, bring your legs to bear. Take advantage of the fact that in every body, our legs are stronger than our opponent's arms. Another critical principle in our approach to Kimura is the head chancery principle. The head is a big part of finishing a Kimura successfully. Of course, on the surface, Kimura is just a lock of my two arms on one of my opponent's arms. Nonetheless, almost all of the effective defense to a Kimura lock comes from our opponent's ability to move his head around and escape. If you can lock your opponent's head down, usually with your legs, you will dramatically increase your chance of controlling your opponent and preventing escape. In addition, when the head can't move, the shoulder girdle becomes very strongly locked and the elbow and shoulder become much more vulnerable to breaks. Our favorite way of achieving head chancery or head trapping is through the use of triangles. You will see throughout this video the use of the so-called trimura, a hybrid between Kimura and triangles. As much as possible, we like to lock up our opponent's head with our legs, and from there we find the finishing techniques are much more effective. Another critical principle in the Kimura system that we employ is the power from position principle. This refers very clearly to two critical concepts we use all the time from both top and bottom position. This is the notion of a power line. There are certain positions that I can occupy relative to my opponent. When I'm on top, it is a line that goes from my opponent's shoulder to opposite hip. When I'm on bottom, it's a line that goes along the line of my opponent's shoulders through his elbow and my head. If we can achieve these two power lines in top and bottom position, you will dramatically increase the amount of power you can bring to bear into the Kimura lock upon your opponent. Don't think of Kimura as a power move in itself. Rather, think of it as a move which can be extraordinarily powerful if you achieve these two positions. It's the position that gives you power. Don't rely on your muscular strength, rely on your body's positioning, and you will find Kimura is an extraordinarily powerful move which will often bring you success in competition. Another truly important core concept of the Kimura system that we employ is the gateway principle. Kimura is so much more than just a submission hold. It's a gateway into many other positions and many other submissions. Always remember in Jiu-Jitsu that the value of a given move is not just the move in itself, but what it offers in terms of alternatives. What comes off the move? What are the things that I can go from if the move should fail or if I should encounter strong resistance? Kimura offers an extraordinary number of alternative methods of attacking our opponent. If the initial figure 4 Kimura should be stymied by resistance, there's so many other things we can switch to, so many other submissions, so many other positions. We will be exploring all of these in the course of this video. So there's a general sense in which you can see very clearly this outline of the Kimura system. It begins with a multiplicity of Kimuras. 7 in fact in this particular system. Then the foundation, the figure 4 Kimura, and a central problem. Can I get the hand behind the back or not? If the hand can go behind, go directly into submission holds. Establish power line, whether you're in top or bottom position, and go for your submission. If you cannot quickly and efficiently get the hand behind the back, then we have the first alternative of employing our legs to increase power. Go into cross kimura, kimura plata, etc., etc. Alternatively, we could switch completely to another submission hold, arm bars or triangles, or we could switch to another position. Usually it's the back, since we favor that above all. The two main methods involve the T Kimura position and the head and arm Kimura position that we'll be looking at in the course of this video. This provides us a very good general framework to work with, where we start to see Kimura as part of a simple but highly effective system of attacking our opponent, rather than to see it as just a simple submission hold like any other. It's time to start our look into the Kimura lock as a submission hold. That's where we're going to start. We're going to start with the mechanics of breaking with Kimura, and we're going to start with an overview, a very, very important concept I work with constantly with my students, which I often refer to as the Trinity of Power. That's a rather fancy sounding title for something pretty simple. Mateus is just going to lie down, head here, feet this way. And from here, we're going to talk about Kimura as a move where we actually go into break our opponent's arm. Now, there are a vast number of positions in which we can apply Kimura. We're going to be looking at almost all of them over the course of this video, but we've got to start somewhere. I've always believed the best place to start the inquiry is what we call a side Kimura, where I'm across my training partner's side and we apply a Kimura in the classic fashion. Okay? Why? Because this is probably the single clearest way, the most obvious way in which we can illustrate the underlying principles behind Kimura. Now, the three main areas that I want you to focus on when we go to work with Kimura, we can state them right now. The first, once we've got our opponent's hand relatively close to his back, like so, and we're in a position now to start to apply pressure, is our opponent's head. Almost all of my opponent's escapes to Kimura involve movement of the head. Okay, if my opponent can free the head and move the head, he can substantially lessen the amount of breaking power that I can apply to the Kimura, and ultimately he can escape. So control of the head is going to be one of the big things that we work on in this video series. The next is the concept of the shoulder line. The shoulder line is a straight line that joins Mateus's two shoulders together. You will notice something interesting. The further Mateus's elbow is away from the shoulder line, the less pressure he feels in his shoulder. When the elbow comes north up to the shoulder line, so that we have elbow, shoulder, and shoulder in a straight line, there will be radically more tension in his arm and much less work needed on my part to get an effective break. Okay, so that will be our second big theme. The first is we must control our opponent's head, and the more control we have over our opponent's head, the less slack and movement there will be in my opponent's arm, and as a result the breaks will come more easily. The second is this idea of moving my training partner's elbows up to the shoulder line. Okay, if we can get the elbow up to the shoulder line, breaking becomes a lot easier. The third is the use of my legs to create pressure in Kimuras. Now, this can be done in many, many ways. Okay, I'll demonstrate one which we'll be using a lot throughout this series. In a situation where my opponent has his hands locked, for example, and I cannot get the hand behind the back, we've got to do something about this. We've got to start using Kimura in creative ways. So, for example, I could take my leg and make it part of this Kimura attack. So we will now be using our legs to enact the power of the Kimura rather than just the hands. Okay, and from here, as my legs become part of the attack, we can get around this problem that it's just my two hands working against my opponent's hands. Now, that's just one of many, many ways in which we can use the legs. They can be, even in situations where I'm just using my hands to hold the Kimura, I can use my legs in creative ways to supply the power of the Kimura. What I want you getting away from is the idea that Kimura is just your hands against his arm. Rather, what I want you working towards is the idea that your hands transmit the power of your legs and hips to his arm. The hands are just the transmitters. The horsepower of the Kimura, regardless of the type we use, will come from your legs and hips. If we can understand these three key principles, number one, always look to control your opponent's head to the maximum degree possible, understanding that if the head is free, your opponent can play all kinds of tricks to lessen the danger to his arm and ultimately even escape. The second, the idea of the shoulder line, that the more the elbow comes up to the shoulder line, the more devastating your Kimura holds will become. And third, the use of your legs to supply the real horsepower behind a Kimura. Regardless of the kind of Kimura you're employing, you always want to be using the legs and hips as the backbone of your power. The arms merely transmit the power of the legs and the hips to your opponent's arms. We'll be looking at a vast number of Kimuras over the course of this video, but those three key themes create the underlying background to true breaking power whenever we work with Kimura. We will be coming back to those three themes throughout this video. Understanding from the start, and your understanding as you progress through the video will be greatly enhanced. A question which I'm often asked is, should I use my thumb in Kimura or not? Okay, there's two schools of thought here. Many people will tell you that the right thing to do in situations like this is to take a thumbless grip and lock up your Kimura like so, no thumbs, okay? Then you'll have other people who argue you should always use the thumb, lock it in, and lock up like so, okay? So we get this debate. Should I use the thumb in the application of Kimura holds or not? And there tends to be very vocal support for one or the other. My take on this is pretty simple. If you did have the requisite strength to turn your opponent's forearm with your thumb, then it would be a valuable thing to do. Okay. Here's the theory why people say you should use your thumb. The idea is that when I grab Mateus's wrist like so, if I were able to put a turning force on Mateus's forearm, that creates tension which Mateus feels now in his arm. And when it's done like this, you feel it, man, if I locked up a Kimura in this position, that would definitely add a little twisting power to the lock. It is a twisting lock after all. When I turn my training partner's wrist, it takes my opponent's elbow in a forwards direction, which facilitates the break. Okay. The idea is that if I use my thumb in this fashion, I add a certain percentage of braking power to the lock. I create a more efficient twist in the arm, and it's a twisting lock after all. That should theoretically add to the power. Now, there's some practical problems here. Mateus is very relaxed, and he was being nice, and he was letting his wrist turn so I could demonstrate for the camera. But if Mateus makes a strong resistant arm, okay, when I go to turn my training partner's wrist, what almost always happens is my hand simply turns around his wrist doesn't move. Okay, again, if he's relaxed, sure, I could turn his wrist and put an extra twist in there, but if he makes a strong resistant arm, when I go to turn, my thumb simply rotates around and you don't get the turning effect that people wanted. I'm going to say this: over the years I have seen many people broken with Kimura. I've seen people have their arms completely broken, both with thumbless grips and without thumb. That should tell you something. It clearly demonstrates that the position of your thumb is not critical to breaking power. If you look at video footage, it's out there, you can see it, of people having their arm completely broken in competition, you're going to see a roughly even number of thumb grips and thumbless grips. That evidence is pretty compelling. It tells you very clearly that it's not the thumb which is doing the breaking. Don't obsess over whether the thumb is involved or not. Okay? As a general rule, when I go with people with smaller wrists, I often use my thumb. If I go with someone much heavier weight category, gargantuan wrists, I typically go without a thumb. In fact, there are many Kimuras, we saw one earlier, which don't involve any thumb whatsoever, but rather a leg position. Here, there's no possible twist of my training partner's wrist because there's no hand on the wrist at all. There's no use of the thumb whatsoever. And yet from here, we can quickly develop devastating kimuras without the use of any kind of twist. So clearly, this should tell you that it's not the twisting effect upon the wrist which supplies the breaking power of a kimura. So my advice to you is pretty simple. Don't obsess over thumb or no thumb. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that highly effective breaks can be done with or without the thumb when it's time to go to break someone. And of course, for versions of kimura employing the legs, there's no thumb at all, and yet you can still break someone very easily. Now that's with regards breaking power. There's another aspect of kimura, which is entering into the kimura, where the question of thumb or no thumb does become important. Okay, and I will be spending quite a bit of time on that in this video. As far as breaking mechanics go, I believe that ultimately the answer will come down to personal preference. I don't mean to sound horrible by saying, but I've personally broken people's arms with kimura, both with and without a thumb, and it made no effective difference in the act of breaking. I'm not saying that to be a tough guy or anything, it's just that's what happened. But when it comes time to set up kimuras, then the presence of a thumb or no thumb does have ramifications, and we'll be looking at that later in this video. Let's go further into the mechanics of kimura as a submission hold, as an attempt to physically break someone's arm. First, let's understand a critical distinction in jiu-jitsu between linear locks and twisting locks. Okay, all these submission holds, all the joint locks of jiu-jitsu can be divided into two kinds. There's linear locks. So for example, a classic armbar, judogatame, would be an example of a linear lock where the arm goes straight out. Okay, let's demonstrate, for example. My training partner lies down. Lie down. Okay. A classic judogatame would be a classic example here of a linear lock where the arm is taken straight, and from here straight pressure is put against the elbow. Okay, another good example on two knees, Mateus, would be udigatame. This too would be a good example of a straightened lock where the arm comes out straight, and from here we go into a good attacking position. Okay, so these would be examples of a straight lock. In leg locking, for example, a knee bar or an Achilles lock, these are forces where locks where the forces are put in straight lines. These stand in distinction to twisting locks. So for example, a figure four toe hold, a heel hook, an Americana lock. These are good examples of twisting locks where there's a twist around the joint. Kimura obviously is a good example of a twisting lock. You always have to have that in mind as you go to apply it. In any twisting lock, you're going to have what we call a pull hand and a push hand. Let's have a look at this now. In the case of kimura, we have a training partner down. We have a relatively bent arm. Let's understand something about kimura. The degree of the bend is variable. Okay, we work often with kimuras where there is a greater than 90-degree angle on the arm, but my personal preference is for kimuras where there is less than 90 degrees on the arm. Okay, don't kid yourself. You can break someone's arm when it's greater than 90 degrees, and we'll be looking at how to do that very soon. But my general preference is for the arm to be in less than 90 degrees, like so. Okay. Once we get the arm bent to some degree, you're going to have a push arm and a pull arm. When I lock up with my training partner, I have two hands in place. One hand will provide a pushing force on the wrist, and the other will provide a pulling force on the elbow. Okay, so my left arm here is pulling on the elbow, while the right hand is pushing on the wrist. I'm no historian of catch wrestling, but I'm told that the old-time catch wrestlers used to refer to the hand on the wrist as the stopper hand. There's a lot of wisdom in that, because in truth, rather than push on the wrist, we typically tend to hold and immobilize the wrist while we pull with the elbow. We'll be coming back to this theme a lot as we go through the breaking mechanics of kimura. But this idea of using my push hand to stop my opponent's wrist in place is a good one. It's a wise one and shows the wisdom of those old-time catch wrestlers. But let's make this clear distinction now between my push hand and my pull hand, okay? And we're always looking to create a strong pull on our training partner's elbow, while at very least immobilizing the wrist and working from this position. These are the core concepts that we'll be working with as we go into this Kimura series, this idea of a push and pull. So we have two opposing forces on the joint, creating tremendous twisting pressure, which in extreme cases can completely take your opponent's elbow out of its socket. It's time we started getting into the specifics of breaking mechanics of Kimura. We've given you a lot of theory, a lot of background information. Now it's time to get into the nuts and bolts. We're going to start, as I said earlier, with side Kimura. There are dozens of ways we can apply Kimura. We'll be looking at a bunch of them later in this video, but I've always believed side Kimura is the clearest and simplest place to start. It's the place to start your Kimura journey if this is new to you, or to build new skills into your game. I want to start with the positioning of my hands and arms, because ultimately my hands and arms are the mechanism of transmitting the force of my body to my opponent's arm. Think about an automobile. If I gave you a fancy car with a 700 horsepower engine, that sounds impressive, but whatever power is in the engine is not as important as the car's ability to transmit that power into the four wheels to the road. You could have a 700 horsepower engine, but if it's rigged up to a broken transmission, none of that horsepower is going to make it to the wheels, and the car's not going to move. So too with a Kimura. All the power of my Kimura comes from my legs and hips, but it's transmitted to my opponent's arms through my hands and arms. And so the placement of my hands and arms is extremely important. Let's look now at some of the key concepts involved here. First of all, understand something. Kimura is one of the single best demonstrations of the principles of lever and fulcrum in all of jiu-jitsu, or all of grappling. It's used in many other styles of grappling as well. You're not going to see clearer examples of lever and fulcrum in operation than you will in the case of Kimura. So it's absolutely critical that right from the start we understand what is the end of the lever, what's the optimal place to place the fulcrum. Okay, regardless of whether I use thumb or no thumb, we'll come back to that later in the video, and regardless of whether my opponent's arm is bent more than 90 degrees or less than 90 degrees, my hand placement and my elbow placement doesn't change. We'll look soon at bending the arm, but first, hand placement, elbow placement. Okay, I want to work with the end of the lever. Okay, let's understand what is the lever involved here. The lever goes from the point of my training partner's elbow all the way up here to the smallest thumb knuckle. Okay, that's the length of the lever that you work with. If you grab the wrist, you are grabbing further down the lever than is optimal. You've taken the short end of the lever, and as a result, you're going to have to use more force to get the same results. If I go all the way up here to the end of the lever, that sounds good, right? Grabbing the end of the lever, but there's a problem. You're grabbing over a flexing joint, and that can diminish the application of power to your opponent's arm. So that's not optimal either. The ideal compromise between finding a fixed, strong point and maximizing the length of the lever is to take your middle finger and put it around the bend of your training partner's wrist, regardless of whether you're going with a thumb or without a thumb. This way you get a big bite on the end of the lever, but you're holding something fixed, the wrist, rather than the moving hand. So this is always my favorite place to grip. So if Matthias sits up, you'll see my middle finger goes right over the fold of the wrist. And this is the optimal placement for maximizing the length of the lever and maximizing the fixity of the part of the arm that you're gripping. Now, with regards my second hand, you will see this common mistake. People will grab anywhere they want on their own hand. Okay, that's also not going to cut it. Remember, my pull hand also wants to work at the end of the lever. So it's important that I grab my own hand, and I like to cover my own knuckles. In this way, you will see there is no daylight between my wrist and Mateus's wrist. The more daylight that you can see between my wrist and Mateus's wrist, the more danger there is of him bringing his hand in towards his own body and ultimately slipping out. And there's a general lack of fixity and tightness to the lock, which will often have negative consequences when you go into finish. So I like to take my wrist and bring it all the way up so there's physical contact with his wrist. And I, as always, want to grab the middle finger to my own wrist. In this way, we have a very, very tight coverage of our training partner. And you will see there is no daylight between my hands and my opponent's hands. You come in, lock. Now, the last element here of arm positioning. Look at my left elbow. I have done a poor job of maximizing the use of the end of the lever. The closer my elbow is to Mateus's armpit, the less lever force I can apply to my opponent's arm. I always want, as much as possible, to bring my elbow to his elbow. Now I'm maximizing the end of the lever. Again, the further my elbow from his, the more the Kimura degenerates into a push with my right hand instead of what it should be, a pull with my left arm. Okay? A concept we're going to come back to again and again in this video is the idea of a pull dominant Kimura. Remember, you have two hands. One is a pushing hand and one is a pulling arm. As a general rule, I like to see pull dominant Kimuras, where the primary force application is through a pull rather than a push. This is your first look at this vital concept now with hand positioning, but we'll be coming back to this in substantial detail later on. But let's look again at this idea of hand placement. There's the length of the lever from the point of the elbow to the smallest knuckle. If I grab the knuckle itself, I have to work through your opponent's flexing wrist. That's not optimal. So instead, we take our middle finger and we cover our training partner's wrist. Then I take my second middle finger and cover my own wrist. So there's absolutely no daylight between my wrist and Mateus's wrist. And then from here, we focus on sweeping elbow to elbow. Obviously, don't go beyond, that's a disaster. We come in, my elbow always just inside his elbow. And regardless of whether the arm is more than 90 degrees or less than 90 degrees, we're going to be in a strong braking position with handwork like that. We're looking at the mechanics of Kimura. We just looked at the aspects of hand and elbow positioning. Now we're going to go to one of the next great questions of Kimura mechanics. This is whether my opponent's arm should be more than 90 degrees or less than 90 degrees. Okay, I've said this earlier and I'll say it again. I've seen absolutely debilitating breaks in both scenarios. Okay, so we know for a fact elbows can be broken more than 90 degrees and less, but I do have a preference for keeping the elbow sharply bent. The breaks here tend to be more catastrophic. You can generally exercise greater control over your opponent's arm, lower his ability to resist. So whenever I can, if I feel I can take the arm in and bend it to less than 90 degrees, I will always do so. We'll look at the action of bending an arm from a side Kimura situation. We'll start off with a training partner in a relatively straight arm position, just like so. Okay, we've seen already that we need our hands in a position where there's no daylight between my hands and his. Okay, now part of the problem here is that Mateus's back is flat on the ground, and as a result, I have no ability to pull. Make a strong arm, Mateus. I have no ability to pull his arm in behind his back, because ultimately that's what I want to do. I want to bend and put his hand behind his back. So the first thing I have to be able to do is to expose Mateus's back. I have to be able to take his back off the ground. Now, the best way for me to do this is to put up a support leg, just like so. It's very hard for me to do this if I have two knees on the ground. So I put up a support leg. Then from here, I take my elbow to Mateus's elbow. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to point my elbow at the ceiling. When I go to point my elbow at the ceiling, Mateus's back will always come up off the ground. In addition, this creates a situation where Mateus's left wrist is behind his own elbow. And as a result, it's very easy for me to throttle my wrist as though I were throttling a motorcycle. Off the throttled wrist position, I bring his hand all the way in behind his back. And now we get the ideal of a bent arm where the hand is locked behind the back. If Mateus tries to take his hand out of this position, he's in such a mechanically weak position that it's almost impossible. Okay? There's a sense here in which your wrist position, as you go to throttle your opponent's hand, is very similar to a completely unrelated sport, the sport of arm wrestling. If Mateus and I are facing each other on the knees, and we go down to a belly position like so, and we perform arm wrestling, a big part of who wins and who loses has to do with my ability to get my hand over the top of my opponent's hand. If Mateus brings his hand over the top of mine, he will be able to dominate my arm down to the floor. So always we're looking to bring everything in and my hand on top of his, so we can put a severe force and bring his arm down. That's exactly what we do when we want to bend our training partner's arm and put it behind the back. The first thing we do, step number one, is to get his back off the ground. We do that by pointing our elbow at the ceiling. Step number two is to dominate his wrist by throttling my hand over in much the same way that an arm wrestler does. And from this position, I can easily draw the hand in to a position of weakness behind his back, so that when Mateus tries to recover his arm from this position and get the hand out, it's almost impossible. And from here, we're in a position to enact the braking mechanics that we'll soon be looking at. This idea of getting a severe bend in our training partner's arm, of taking a straightened arm, putting it all the way in to a position of extreme weakness behind the back, where we can easily hold the hand through the use of elbow to the ceiling and the arm wrestling throttled wrist, is critical to our success. One more time. We start with my opponent with a strong resistant arm. Strong resistant arm, good. From here, no matter how strong his arm, we can always take his back off the floor just by pointing our elbow up at the ceiling. Now I take my wrist over his, and as a result, we can easily bring the hand in behind the back into a position of extreme weakness. In a situation like this, I don't care how strong your opponent is. This is not a strong man's move. This is just pure mechanical perfection at this point, and a much weaker man can easily control a much stronger man under those circumstances. You will be pleasantly surprised how through these simple applications of leverage, you will dispel the myth that it takes a strong man to apply a Kimura. All it requires is precise placement of lever and fulcrum, knowing what you're doing to expose your opponent's back up off the floor, and then using the old arm wrestling trick to put the hand in behind the back into a position of extreme weakness. It's time now we come to one of the most crucial aspects of Kimura, particularly from the side Kimura position that we're starting our inquiry with. This is the notion of the diagonal power line. First, what is a diagonal power line? Let's have a look at this now. Okay, my opponent is down in a side position. Okay. Typically, when people go into Kimura, they think they do so from a perpendicular angle. Okay, they go across their opponent's body, and from here they go to work. Anytime I go to apply a Kimura from this position, if I'm perpendicular to my opponent, that limits the degree to which I can lift his back off the floor and put a hand in behind him into a braking position. Okay, a much better approach is for me not to go across my opponent's side perpendicular, but rather to line myself up in a straight line that goes from Mateus's left hip to his right shoulder. This diagonal line from opposite hip to opposite shoulder is where I want to be lined up when I apply the side Kimura. So essentially, I want a situation where my body follows this line on my training partner. My legs will be at 90 degrees. Ultimately, I'll step over my opponent's head because I want to control his head, a theme that we saw earlier today. But this is the optimal breaking position, where my hip dominates his right shoulder and my shoulder dominates his left hip. This diagonal line across Mateus's body is the preferred and mechanically optimal breaking position, not a perpendicular position. Okay? Now, let's have a look at how we use this power line in operation, how it does a good job of locking my opponent's head and shoulders down and creates a very, very strong breaking position, which is a noticeable improvement over just going perpendicular. So we'll start off with the basic Kimura, just like so. We're going to start off here by lifting his elbow off the floor and rolling the wrist inwards. From this position, I'm going to walk my hips up to Mateus's shoulder, and I'm going to move, as I step over his head, my head down here towards his hips. I sweep my elbow towards his elbow, and my legs separate to 90 degrees. This is the optimal breaking position. From here, it's very easy for me to take my head back and away and apply a pulling force. If my head is in close, it limits the degree to which I can pull. Only when my spine straightens and my head moves back towards the power line do I get optimal pulling pressure on my opponent's arm. Again, if my head crowds my opponent's head, it limits the pull. We want a pull dominant Kimura, where my head moves back and we get this tremendous breaking pressure. I'm going to demonstrate the same move from a different angle. Again, the power line is never across my opponent's body in a perpendicular angle. It goes from Mateus's one shoulder to opposite hip. My body has to line up on that line. That's where we get maximum breaking leverage from. So once I get a hold of my training partner's arm, I want to use for want of a better phrase, I must beat Mateus's shoulder. What does that mean, to beat the shoulder? It means my hip must come up to his shoulder and apply force upon his shoulder line. So that if I were to step over Mateus's head, you would have good head control. We've seen already the basic trinity of power. Controlling and mobilizing your opponent's head is a huge part of succeeding with Kimura. Okay? So once we get our initial lock on our training partner, and we bring everything in, look how I come all the way up and my hip goes over his shoulder. Now, as I step over Mateus's head, I sweep my elbow to his elbow, my head comes down towards his hips, and we're sitting right across the power line. From a position like this, it's so easy for us to apply a pulling force. Even just with one hand, we can get tremendous breaking pressure. A good test, a good empirical test for you as an athlete as to whether or not you're performing the Kimura adequately is to apply a no hands Kimura upon your opponent, or not your opponent, your training partner. Let's have a look at a no hands Kimura as a test of whether or not you're lined up on the power line properly. Okay, we know now what the power line is. It's the line that runs from my opponent's opposite hip to opposite shoulder. Okay, that's where we want to be lined up when we go into apply a Kimura. So we're going to apply the basic lock, just in like so. We're going to sit up to our training partner's hip, step across the head, and from here I have my right hand is not even touching my opponent, and my left hand is not touching his wrist at all. Just the blade of my wrist is on his wrist. That's it. I sweep my elbow to his, and from here, as my head moves back, we're getting a pull for maximum breaking power, and I have no hands touching him. Okay? Just the edge of my wrist on the edge of his wrist. This shows us very clearly that we're maximizing the pulling effect. We're not pushing at all on our training partner's arm, rather just the mechanical perfection of the position along that power line is doing the mechanical work for us. Let's look now at a crucial notion behind the application of force in Kimura. This is the idea of a pull dominant Kimura versus a push dominant Kimura. If we have Mateus down in a side position where he's on one side, from here you will often see people go to apply Kimuras where the primary force involved is a pushing force, okay? And you'll see people pushing Kimuras, okay? This always results in too much movement in the opponent's flexible shoulder. Remember, the shoulder joint is one of the most mobile in the human body. Now, ultimately, the target of most Kimura attacks is the elbow. That's what actually breaks in the overwhelming majority of Kimura attacks. But nonetheless, the shoulder is involved, and the more play there is in the shoulder, the harder it is to apply a braking force to the elbow. So, anytime we start pushing on people, we tend to get a lot of play in the shoulder joint, and as a result, braking becomes very, very difficult. Okay, rather than work with a push into my opponent's wrist, remember I have a pulling hand and a pushing hand. Rather than work with most of the force being a push through the wrist, we want to mostly focus on a pull through the elbow. Okay, so let's ensure that when we get our opponent into a position and we're going to work, rather than me pushing with the Kimura, which always results in a very feeble looking lock where the whole arm tends to move, what we want to do is to immobilize my opponent's hand here with the push hand, and from here I want to sweep my elbow to his, and I want to focus on a pull of the elbow. The only way I can do this is if my head moves back and away, so we get a strong pull through the elbow joint. Okay? Again, if we're pushing on the arm, the whole arm tends to move through the shoulder joint. What I want is an immobilized shoulder, and I just want the elbow itself moving towards me. Then we get a break in a matter of millimeters, as opposed to no break in many inches. Okay? So always we're looking in these situations to create immobility in the hand, and then immobility in the shoulder and head, so that the only moving element is that elbow, which is being pulled. If we can apply these pull dominant Kimuras, you're going to get a lot more braking success as you work down on the mat. We're going to look now at this critical idea of controlling our opponent's head. We saw earlier in this video what we talked about is the trinity of power, what creates the three most important factors in generating power in any given Kimura. This idea of using our legs to create pressure, this idea of trapping our training partner's head, and this idea of bringing our opponent's elbow up to his shoulder line. If we can get at least one of those three things, you're going to have a strong Kimura attack. If you can get all three, you're going to have a devastating Kimura attack. But at a minimum, I should have at least one of those three elements strongly represented in any given Kimura that I work with. We're going to look now, in the case of a side Kimura, at the idea of passing or beating my training partner's shoulder so that I can use my legs to trap my opponent's head. Let's understand something. If your opponent's going to wiggle his arm into a position where it won't break, or even ultimately to escape from the lock, it's going to be because he's freed his head. If his head can come free, he can first weaken the lock and then ultimately escape from it. So we need to do something to lock that head down and create a strong Kimura attack. Let's look first at the idea of beating the shoulder and then stepping over the head. From a situation, we'll take an angle like so, Mateus, so the camera can pick up what's going on. We're going to start off with a basic Kimura hold. Now, one problem here is that most of your defensive opponents will have their hand here in the hip. That's a good thing for Mateus to do, because it means that from any given side position he can start now to go into his escapes and bring his legs back in, etc., etc. Okay, so that's always what he's going to be looking to do. He's going to be looking to frame here on the hip, and that's going to make it difficult for me to do what I want to do, which is to get my hip up here over my training partner's shoulder. That's what I'm looking for. He obviously will be looking to stop that. Okay, so once I get a hold of a Kimura here, the first problem that I have to deal with is the problem of Mateus's framing right hand. As he puts a strong right hand and forearm in my hip, what am I going to do to get past that hand and forearm and past my opponent's shoulder? Well, make a strong arm here, Mateus. Right arm strong in my hip. Good. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get height over my training partner's shoulder, and I'm going to turn my hips in to collapse his arm. I bring my knee into his ribs, and then I start a backstepping action where when I switch, my weight goes directly over my training partner's shoulder line, just like so. Now from here, as we come in on the arm, we're going to start this action of lifting the elbow joint, and we just step directly over our training partner's head. This puts a definite limit on how far my opponent's head can rise. So as I apply a pulling force on the elbow, his head can't rise. If my leg were not over Mateus's head, when I apply the pulling force, he could simply sit up with me and create problems here. Okay? So I've got to put a limit on how far he can sit up. That limit is done through my left leg. Now it's tempting to put the knee down. That will trap his head better. But now I can't pull on the arm. So I need to have my foot up close to his shoulder line. Only that will enable me to incorporate my legs into the Kimura. My left leg is my drive leg, so that I'm pushing off my left leg, okay? Just like so, as my left leg pushes, we get a tremendous pulling force between my head, spine, and left leg. We get a strong pull on the elbow. Okay, as opposed to what so many people do here, which is just to push with their arms. You get a very weak and anemic looking Kimura doing this kind of thing. But instead, if we fully trap his head and we engage in a pulling motion, the push comes from my leg off the floor. Okay, the pull comes from my upper body and back, moving away from my opponent, and as a result we get that very, very strong pull. My opponent can't follow the pull because my leg goes directly over his head. As a result, we satisfy one of the key elements of that trinity of power, controlling your opponent's head. We've seen that the potential power of a Kimura is always measured most importantly in three ways. To what degree are my legs being incorporated into the Kimura? To what degree is my opponent's elbow being taken up to the shoulder line? And to what degree is his head being controlled? If I can get any one of those three well represented in my Kimura, you're going to have a strong Kimura. If you get all three, it's going to be an absolutely devastating Kimura. Let's look again at the idea of a side Kimura position, and let's look at how we can incorporate my opponent's shoulder line into the equation. We've seen earlier, our opponent's shoulder line is a line that joins his two shoulders. We know now that the further my opponent's elbow from the shoulder line, the less pressure he feels. The more his elbow comes up to the shoulder line, the less work I have to do to get an effective break on my opponent's arm. Okay, so once we lock up on our training partner, I'm going to demonstrate this one on a relatively straight arm. Okay, this is for demonstration purposes. I generally prefer a sharply bent arm, but I want you to see that even a straightened arm like this can be attacked very, very successfully if all the mechanics are correct. Okay, in a situation where I cannot physically bend the arm in, what I will focus on instead, once I get up to my opponent's head and shoulders, is I will physically take his elbow up to the shoulder line. I do this with a pull of my left elbow. I'm not pushing his hand. You can't push an elbow to the shoulder line. You have to pull it. So I first bring my head over the elbow, the exact opposite of what we do to finish the Kimura. Okay, so my head goes forward and I pull. Then I find his elbow to my elbow and my head moves away. Okay, so the first pull is just to drag his elbow up to the shoulder line. If my opponent wants to keep his hand down by the hips, it's not easy just to pull it up in any haphazard fashion. So what I want to do, make a strong arm, Mateus, I want to first just lift and take my opponent's elbow up. Now it's on the shoulder line. When I bring my elbow to his, trap the head, and engage in that pulling action, now we're getting severe breaks. If the arm were down here, it's very, very hard for me to get a break. Okay, I have to do a lot of work to break it from here. So my first action is always to bring it up. My favorite is to bend the wrist in these positions. Okay, but I'm just demonstrating on a straight arm. It's a little easier on my training partner and also shows that a straight arm break is possible. Once the elbow goes up to the center line, to the shoulder line, then everything is about the pull backwards. Okay, so if we take the extra time to take our opponent's elbow up to the shoulder line and do our breaking from here rather than down here, we have to do substantially less mechanical work to enact the same or even more devastating breaks. I'm sure in your training, many of you have had this frustrating experience. You'll have a tough and talented opponent, bottom side control. You've done that good work of passing his guard. You've trapped the hold of your training partner's wrist. Your arms are in and you know what you want to do. You want to get a Kimura, okay? But when it's time to connect the frame of the Kimura, you physically can't get your hand to your wrist, okay? And you're trying your best to lock up and you feel you can't make the actual figure four hold, which constitutes the beginnings of a strong Kimura attack, okay? The temptation is to bring the hand up the wrist and then grab, okay? I'll cover that later. Done well, it's a viable strategy. Done badly, it's a disaster because now you're grabbing the short end of the lever. But there's other things we can do here. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the optimal place to grab his wrist. We've already established it's right in here, whether I use thumb or no thumb. Okay, I'm going to recommend, for the purposes of what we're about to look at, that we're going to use a thumb grip. Okay, you'll remember earlier I said that for braking mechanics, thumb or no thumb doesn't make a lot of difference, but it does make a difference on setups. Okay, this is a good example of this, one of many. If I hold with no thumb and my hands are not locked, there's no reason why Mateus can't simply pommel his wrist out in this direction and escape. Okay, so if my hands are unlocked, I will use my thumb and I'll lock in the usual fashion. Okay, now when he goes to pommel his hand out, it's significantly more difficult. Okay, again, if my hands are not locked in the figure of four, there's no reason, if I have no thumb, Mateus can't take his hand inside mine and recover his arm position. So whenever my hands are unlocked, I use my thumb. Now, I want to lock my wrist, but Mateus is doing a really good job of keeping his arm straight and I can't get out there. Okay? In these situations, don't try to claw for your own wrist. Change your body position. What I do is I step over my opponent's body and I bring my elbow down to his elbow. Then from here, I focus on separated hands and I lift. Once the elbow goes off the mat, there's no reason why I can't throttle my training partner's hands and bring the hands in together. And then once again, we're back in business. Okay? So once again, we start off, you've got everything in place, but you just can't get your hands locked in the traditional figure of four. I use my thumb for this situation, for reasons we just explained. I bring my body close so that my elbow can go to his elbow, and we start a pulling action on my training partner's arm. Once we start the pull, now I can turn the wrist in, and lo and behold, elbow deep, I can always connect. From this position, we bring the wrist into a traditional bent arm finishing position. We step over the head, and now we're in the perfect position to get our breaks. Second method of dealing with this annoying situation. Again, I'm in here and I can't get to my own wrist. I will shorten the lever temporarily and grab my own wrist. Okay, so I'm grabbing halfway down the forearm. This is a leverage disaster, but it's not a bad grip to actually hold someone. Okay, I'm grabbing way down the short end of the lever. That's not good, but at least I do have a grip of a figure of four. So if he goes to twist his arm out, it won't be easy. Now, I bring everything down and I start an action of lifting. And then off the lift, I just work my way down the wrist. So we go in 2 steps. Now, just like all the other times, we focus on sweeping the hand in behind, and then we drive forward, foot goes over, elbow to elbow, and we're ready to break. These simple tactics enable us to get around this initially vexing problem and get to a nice secure figure 4 hold from where we can successfully attack the arm. we've been looking in some detail at the precise braking mechanics and underlying theory behind Kimura attacks from a side position. That's always the best place for us to start our Kimura study and develop our skills. I want to look now in some detail at one of the truly essential skills of the entire Kimura game and of my system in particular. This is the skill of rolling an opponent through in any uncontrolled Kimura scramble situation where you've successfully got the hand behind the back, but you haven't pinned your opponent down. You must understand this is a very, very common scenario whenever you work with Kimura. As you practice more and more with Kimura, you will find yourself quite often in this situation. The good news is, if you can manage to keep your opponent's hand behind his back, you will dominate the scramble. Okay? Have confidence in this and know that as we come out of a given Kimura scramble, we can go directly into the finishing mechanics that we just saw. The main cue here is just to focus on keeping your opponent's hand behind the back and dominating the spiraling roll through as a result. Let's look at the situation from a side Kimura. Once we start off in a position like so, we know that a big part of our initial gambit here is to take our opponent's back off the floor. Now there's a certain degree of risk associated with this. As my opponent's back comes off the floor, I need to keep his head down. Okay, that's why beating the shoulder and extending the leg over the top was seen as so important. But there's always going to come a day that as you lift the back off the floor, your opponent's going to sit rapidly up with you, and you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're losing control of the pin. You've still got the Kimura, the hand is still behind the back, but you've lost control of the pin. The shoulders are coming off the mat. Don't panic, okay? You still own your opponent as long as his hand stays behind the back. Yes, you've lost the pin. It's not the end of the world. The hand behind the back takes precedence over the pin. What I want to do in these situations is avoid what most people do, which is now to let go and scramble back to a neutral position. Okay, most people say, oh my God, I've lost the pin, and they try to recover the position. You're in a neutral position here. Neither one of you has any advantage over the other. It's a battle now for head height. If Mateus's head goes higher than mine, I'm going to end up going backwards. And I try to get my head higher than his hips move away from me, and we end up back in a neutral position. Okay? It didn't have to be that way. Remember, as long as the hand is behind the back, you're doing just fine. So, when I go to pull my opponent's head up, if he beats me with the head and I start losing it, don't let go and don't even stay on this side of his body. Have the confidence in the hand behind the back. If I move to my left, Mateus can bring his hand forward, and that's a disaster. Because if the hand goes in front, now you got a problem. What I want to do is bring my head to his elbow. I want to exaggerate the loss of the pin. So I just jackknife my hips and put my head down here. And I let Mateus come up. I make it easier for him. And then from here, I take satisfaction in the fact the hand is still behind the back. There's nothing to stop me now from taking my left leg and pointing in this direction and just taking my training partner right back over and back into the same pin with that devastating Kimura in place. This time, I've covered Mateus's head with my legs and I've beaten the shoulder so that from here we can apply the correct braking mechanics in the way that we saw earlier and get the win. Let's have a look at this scramble roll situation in more detail. We'll start over here so that you can clearly see the dynamic of the roll. Once we go through on our training partner and lock up, we've seen that as we go to lift, there's a danger now of my opponent's head coming off and I'm losing the pin. The natural human tendency is to either let go and fight the pin. That's not good because you're in a very unstable position here. And even if I did end up on top, he's probably going to get his hips back out and you'll end up back in neutral. Okay. The other danger is that as we come up, I stay on this side of his body. That's not good. He can cover me here and get his hand back in front. So what I want to focus on is keeping the hand behind the back and actually facilitating his upward trajectory. So I just go around the corner and out of his path. Now I focus on turning everything to my left and taking him over. This time, when we come up with the head covered, so that when he tries to continue the roll through, his head won't move because of the position of my leg. And then we go through a pull positioned right on our training partner's diagonal line of power, and from there we get to finish. Let's have a look at this roll through sequence one more time. It's absolutely critical that as a Kimura student you get familiar with this roll, because this will happen to you on many, many occasions as you go to apply Kimuras from a variety of positions, not just this one. We'll look at other positions later in this video where roll throughs like this are very, very common. You have to know how to guide the roll in your desirable directions, not his. So once we lock up with our training partner, have faith in one thing: the mechanical advantage of putting the hand behind the back. One of the great themes of this entire video is that if your opponent's hand is behind the back, he is in such a mechanically weak position that all the usual strictures of jiu-jitsu with regards to position go out the window. Okay, I can willingly give up bottom cross side position. I will willingly throw my back on the ground and let my opponent across side, knowing that his hand is behind his back. I would never normally do that under normal circumstances. It would be a disaster. But as long as the hand's behind the back, not only is it good, it's desirable. Okay? So that's our focus. Keep the hand behind the back. Don't panic and try to go back to a neutral position. This is not good. You can end up in bad situations here. So once the hand goes in behind, as Mateus comes up, look how I willingly jump across his hips and I willingly give up bottom side control, knowing full well that he can't exploit it. If Mateus tried to come up to his knees and pin me here, I would simply break his arm from bottom position. He has to roll through. He'll lose his arm. But when he rolls through, we're already tripoded over the head. We're located right on the power line, and there's the pull dominant finish for the win. Learning how to guide your opponent through these Kimura scrambles, learning how to have faith in the idea that once the hand goes behind the back, you have an enormous mechanical advantage over your opponent, is a big part of your development as a student of Kimura.